All right, thank you. Welcome everyone to the second event in CLIP's Growing the Movement virtual series. I'm Lucy Trainer, CLIP's Deputy Director of Systems and Sustainability. And if you don't know CLIP yet, we're a reproductive justice movement building organization. We inspire, educate, train, and support new activists in leadership to secure reproductive and sexual rights, freedom, and justice for everyone. And you can learn more about us and our programs on our website. I'm so excited today for this workshop on population control and eugenics with Anne Hendrixson. If you joined us last week for the panel on sterilization and the carceral state, you know that we touched on this conversation, and now we have a chance to go deeper and learn more about population control and how these ideologies show up in public health and governmental policy, and how we can work against this as reproductive rights, health, and justice advocates. Before I introduce Anne, I want to briefly share some logistical information. ASL interpretation and CART captioning are being provided for this event. Sign language interpreters should be on your main screen, and there's a link to the transcript pinned at the top of the chat. If you have any trouble accessing either, please message any of the staff who have organizer next to their name in the chat. Please take a look at the pinned messages in the chat for hop-in troubleshooting tips, our community norms, and other resources. And we'll also share an evaluation form in the chat at the end of the event, so please take a minute to fill that out. I want to thank our sponsors for this event. Please check out their virtual booths in the expo hall when the event is over. And if your business or organization is interested in sponsoring the rest of the series, please message any of the event organizers to connect. Now I'm pleased to introduce today's facilitator and my good colleague, Anne Hendrixson. Anne is the director of the Population and Development Program, or PopDev, at CLIP. Anne researches, writes, and speaks on issues of population control, populationism, and contraceptive safety as reproductive justice issues. She is an advocate for sexual and reproductive health and rights, including safe and accessible abortion. Anne co-edited a 2020 themed section of Gender, Place, and Culture, a feminist journal of geography, and co-authored its introduction, Confronting Populationism, Feminist Challenges to Population Control in an Era of Climate Change. Anne received her BA in Gender Studies and Dance from Hampshire College and her MA in Development Studies from Clark University. Thank you, Anne, for being here today, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lucy, and welcome everybody. I'm really excited to be here with you, and I'm really delighted to be part of this series. Today, we're going to take a critical look at population control and eugenics. We'll examine the history of each and then take it into today. But first, I want to hear from you. On the right-hand side of your screen, there's a poll. It should have a red dot next to it. And if you haven't answered it yet, just click on the poll and answer, give your best answer. I'll give you a moment to do that. I want to hear from you where you're at and coming into this discussion. So it looks as though the votes are still coming in. But so far, those of you who have answered, it looks like in general, there are people here who are familiar with population control and eugenics, but want to learn more. Delightful that there are people at either end of the spectrum who challenge population control and eugenics every day in their work, and some who completely new. So thank you for answering that. All right, I'm going to get started with talking about eugenics. Eugenics is a particularly destructive set of beliefs, not a science, that promoted the damaging idea that selective procreation will produce a more evolved, better human race and breed so-called undesirable traits out of our genes. It classified immigrants, Black and brown people, people with disabilities, as, and poor people as undesirable, and white, able-bodied, socially conforming Protestants as desirable. In the United States, this racist, gendered, ableist, anti-poor ideology permeated deep into our institutions and thinking, politics, and even our sense of nature, or what is natural. The crusade to perfect people through eugenics dates roughly from the early 1900s through to World War II. And I'm going to share some of the propaganda from that time to give you a sense of how eugenics was articulated and expressed before we bring it into today. And many of the images that I'm going to show you are from the Eugenics Archive, which is hosted and run by the Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory, which was a hotspot of eugenics activity back in the day. Can you please put the reference for the Eugenics Archive in the chat, please? So if you want to check out these images and the commentary from the thank you. Excellent. If you want to check out the images and the commentary that explains them, this is a great resource. Eugenicists claimed that they were promoting cutting-edge multidisciplinary science. And here we have the logo for the Second International Eugenics Conference, which took place in 1921. It's a sketch of a tree with many roots. And it says, I quote, "Eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. Like a tree, eugenics draws its materials from many sources and organizes them into a harmonious entity. And its roots are labeled genetics, politics, biology, religion, and so on." Critics showed eugenics without scientific merit and disproved notions of degeneracy and racial purity. Nonetheless, eugenics was taken up as an international crusade, and the US was a hotspot of action. The Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations and rich individuals poured money into research and organization. Eugenics was embraced by social movements. This includes birth control advocates like Margaret Sanger, who founder of Planned Parenthood, and environmental conservationists like Madison Grant, who helped to found the US National Park System. It includes organizations like the American Genetics Society, American Breeders Association, and J.H. Kellogg's Race Betterment Foundation, which popularized eugenics in the US mainstream. Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, and Brown were just a few of the colleges and universities that offered classes in eugenics, and the majority of US high school textbooks presented eugenics as legitimate science. Research institutes mobilized teams to measure, characterize, and rank so-called inferior types, to collect dubious data, to inform scholarship and policy. The Eugenics Records Office, which is at Cold Spring Harbor, New York, became the central clearinghouse for the international eugenics movement, with work that was later deemed completely unusable. Influenced by the eugenics movement lobby, policymakers promoted and upheld eugenic laws like sterilization laws and anti-immigrant policy. In other words, eugenics was championed, enacted, and reinforced by a movement of individuals and institutions. Eugenicists reimagined a pure wilderness, emptied of indigenous peoples, as the stage for realizing eugenic ideals. And this is a photo of former US President Theodore Roosevelt and Sierra Club co-founder John Muir at Glacier Point, Yosemite National Park. There are just a few of the environmental conservationists who with eugenics alliances and ideals. And if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend Alexandra Ministern's book, Eugenic Nation. Could you please put that in the chat, Desta? Eugenicists formed the first environmental organizations and facilitated the creation of government land preserves and national parks. These were supposedly pure, unpeopled landscapes for actualizing white Protestant pioneer stock and revitalizing manhood through horseback riding, hunting, and mountaineering. Teddy Roosevelt claimed that staving off race suicide meant using wilderness as a training ground for honing white masculinity. As scholar Jedediah Purdy comments, quote, admiring American nature was a way for a certain kind of white person to become symbolically native to the continent, unquote. This shaped a national understanding of wilderness as an elite white space, obviously not the only way of looking at nature and wilderness. Conservationists sought to preserve it from the masses, particularly the Black and brown masses, and the problems they supposedly caused. Eugenicists attributed social and economic problems like poverty and criminality to biology and bad heredity. This laid the groundwork for targeted interventions into people's bodies, families, and communities. And this is a flashing light exhibit from the Fitter Families Contest at a fair in Topeka, Kansas in 1929. It was put on by the American Genetics Society. And it warns, quote, some people are born to be a burden on the rest. The sign at the top cautions, quote, every 15 seconds, $100 of your money goes for the care of persons with bad heredity, such as the insane, feeble-minded, criminals, and other defectives, end quote. The light bulb flashes and your tax dollars supposedly disappear. The argument here is if criminality and other so-called bad traits can be bred out of humanity, these expensive social problems will be eradicated. The display highlights how eugenics was a source of popular spectacle and entertainment. This was a display at a fair. It intended both to educate and titillate, presumably those who were of good heredity. Eugenics created and perpetuated racialized, classed, ableist, and gendered categories and damaging stereotypes through these wildly inaccurate pedigree charts, family trait forms, and heredity charts. The picture here is from the 1920 American Philosophical Society publication. It's a heredity chart that shows 4 generations and claims to show, quote, race characters do not die out. The racist message here is that brownness is degeneracy and will taint future generations. A paragraph in the corner says there are a host of inherited traits just like that got passed along just like race, including, quote, some forms of insanity, feeble-mindedness, dwarfism, albinism, baldness, absence of teeth, deaf-mutism, and musical ability, end quote. Open-ended, unmeasurable categories like feeble-mindedness meant that just about anyone could be labeled as degenerate. People with marginalized identities or people who stepped outside of social norms like single mothers or people having sex outside of marriage were particularly vulnerable and particularly targeted. Both the damaging stereotypes and the eugenics data that perpetuated them were fodder for racist US law and policy. The eugenics movement lobbied hard for law and policy that protected whiteness and ableism, among other things. Restrictive immigration laws. The eugenics movement provided a scientific rationale for anti-immigrant sentiment in American society at the time. Eugenics Record Office Superintendent Harry Laughlin successfully lobbied for anti-immigrant legislation, like the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924. It limited total immigration to about 15 to 20% of previous peak years, and US immigration did not reach pre-Johnson level acts again until the 1980s. The picture behind the words is shown here is from the Manual of Mental Examination of Aliens from 1918. It's a publication of the Treasury Department of the United States, Public Health Service. This page is called, quote, Examples of Faces of Feeble-Minded Immigrants, unquote. It shows 4 people labeled as unfit as a guide for officials to pathologize and reject immigrants. Racist laws against interracial marriage. Alongside these xenophobic immigration measures, U.S. eugenicists' race-making upheld existing arguments against interracial marriage and creating so-called impure bloodlines. Eugenicists supported the strengthening of old anti-miscegenation laws and the enactment of new ones. For instance, the Virginia Integrity Act of 1924 prohibited marriage between a white person and anyone with a, quote, trace of blood other than Caucasian, unquote. The act was struck down along with all other U.S. anti-miscegenation laws in 1967 with Loving versus Virginia. Sterilization laws for the unfit. The eugenics lobby helped pass sterilization laws in 30 states, under which an estimated 65,000 people were sterilized without consent. Although in 1942, the Supreme Court struck down a law allowing the involuntary sterilization of people who are incarcerated, it never reversed the concept of eugenic sterilization. Contraceptive drives targeting BIPOC. Finally, the eugenics movement embraced birth control. It endorsed the American Birth Control League's clinics to reduce birth rates among the so-called unfit, particularly targeting Black and brown women. As Dorothy Roberts exposes in Killing the Black Body, the alliance of eugenicists and birth control advocates, quote, shaped the meaning of reproductive freedom. Birth control became a means of controlling a population rather than a means of increasing women's reproductive autonomy. Dustin, would you please put Killing the Black Body as a reference in the chat? Eugenics was stigmatized because of the atrocities of the Holocaust. Of course, it didn't disappear, but explicit support quickly faded from the mainstream. And as the eugenics movement weakened, the population control movement rose in its place. What is population control? It is most often described as top-down coercive interventions, often rooted in imperialist foreign policy that had the explicit goal of lowering birth rates. Population control was a primary policy vehicle to reduce birth rates from roughly the 1960s to the mid-1990s. And the visual here on the slide is from a 1979 Population and Development Draper Fund report. And the Draper Fund report was published by the Population Crisis Committee, which is now known as Population Action International. It illustrates population control anxieties and priorities from a US policy perspective. The cover collages a photograph of women in the Global South who seem to be working on a building site with a graphic of the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. It shows the primary target of population control and development, poor women of color in the Global South, juxtaposed with the US government as the primary population control enforcer. This composite image also implies that international development and Global South populations will overwhelm US priorities, which leads to the why of population control. After World War II, population was growing at unprecedented rates and in most countries of the world. At the same time, former colonies were fighting for independence. World leaders saw these dual factors as threats to the emerging world order, and in the case of the US, a barrier to strategic US security interests in other countries, such as access to natural resources or US military bases. They saw population growth as a drag on economic and cultural development. Population growth rates had to drop, the thinking went, in order for so-called underdeveloped nations to industrialize, modernize, and not to rise up and become communist. Population growth was also seen as an environmental hazard. Mainstream environmental thinking set a growing population against a static set of dwindling resources. To save the planet, the thinking went, we must reduce the number of people and quickly. The population control was enforced as an urgent global imperative, a race against time to defuse the population bomb. Pictured here is the population bomb, a 1954 pamphlet produced by the Dixie Cup magnate Hugh Moore. The scissors of population control are snipping the ignited fuse of the Earth as a population bomb. The back cover of the brochure reads, and I quote, "This pamphlet has been prepared by an informal group of business, labor, and professional men concerned with preserving world peace, arresting communism, and improving the lot of people in overpopulated countries." The title was later adopted by biologist and population control evangelist Paul Ehrlich in his much more well-known 1968 book, which blames population growth for environmental degradation, hunger, and war. He warned that because of overpopulation, the battle to feed all mankind would be over in the 1970s, when hundreds of people would starve to death. Famines in poor countries would then ignite apocalyptic war. Ehrlich was wrong. We didn't all starve in the 1970s. Today, there is enough food produced to adequately feed everyone in the world. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, there are enough calories from cereals alone to feed between 10 billion and 12 billion people, and currently there are around 7.8 billion people on the planet. Hunger and malnutrition are largely political. Food scarcity is caused when food is diverted to feed cattle or make fuel because of political corruption and hoarding, because food is a consumer product in capitalist markets and people don't always have money to buy it, or because people lack the land and means to grow food. It is not a problem of too many mouths to feed. However, such criticisms of the population bomb did little to stop the momentum of population control as a way to diffuse it. Population control was enforced by the population establishment, in which the US was once again a hotspot of activity, as with the international eugenics movement. Government agencies like USAID controlled programming and financial flows to recipient countries. Donor governments, including the US and others, funded multilateral agencies, NGOs, and research. Multilateral agencies, and these are the organizations that are funded and supported by multiple countries. They coordinated development efforts, and these include the United Nations Population Fund, World Bank, and International Planned Parenthood Federation. Recipient governments created departments of population and instituted population policy that determined family planning services, and these were often dictated by philanthropic organizations from the US. Philanthropic organizations like the Rockefeller and Ford Foundations determined programming and politics. Knowledge and data producers included universities and research organization nonprofits like the Population Council. Contraceptive developers like the Population Council and producers from big pharma companies partner for greater market reach. Nonprofits like the Association of Voluntary Sterilization, now Engender Health, it's quite a rebrand, Pathfinder, Family Health International, and others, and including consulting firms like the Future Groups, created country-specific interventions, which again, largely from the US, and these were rolled out in different locations by clinics, doctors, and other service providers. As scholar Kalpana Wilson tells us, population control was one of the, quote, most significant and sustained interventions within international development, unquote. And if you could, just a thank you, there's Kalpana Wilson's excellent book, Race, Racism, and Development. It's hard to overstate how much money and political clout went into building and sustaining the population establishment at all levels. Population control discourse promoted damaging racialized and gendered stereotypes of hyperfertility and sexuality in the global South. These contributed to the systematic targeting of poor, Black, and brown women and some men in population control programs and perpetuated violences. Wilson argues that these stereotypes created less valued bodies after eugenics thinking was discredited following World War II. Population control stereotypes also enabled a continuation of colonial attempts to control sex and reproduction. Racial ideologies made population control and development an effective tool in the Cold War for extending imperialism with a new look. Population control stereotypes narrowed ideas about gender and gender relations. Within these stereotypes, gender is a binary, women embody fertility, and controlling men subordinate women. The visual here is from a 1983 Ethical Issues in Family Planning Draper Fund report. This report positions a simple photo of Indian mothers and babies lined up for pediatric care against a larger set of assumptions about overpopulation. It feels crowded and invites the viewer to see too many, rather than to ask why they are crammed into a hallway to receive routine medical care. Because the drive was to reduce fertility sometimes at any cost, population control strategies favored permanent methods like surgical sterilization and long-term contraceptives like the IUD, hormonal shots, and implants. It is important to recognize that some of these methods were experimental at the time and more or less field tested on people as they were disseminated through mass dissemination programs. Sometimes these methods were administered without informed consent, full information about health effects, or any follow-up care. For instance, healthcare providers inserted Norplant implants into nearly 1.5 million women in Indonesia, often without counseling on side effects, pregnancy screening, or proper sterilization of equipment. Many were not told that the implant had to be removed after 5 years or risk ectopic pregnancy. In fact, a 1990 Population Council report said that providers have been trained to insert Norplant, but not to remove it. So even if users experienced health problems or were ready to have it removed, they could not. Population control strategies were often driven by targets and quotas that were meant to reach a certain number of women. To meet these numbers, providers often used incentives like cash and food to encourage people to accept sterilization or long-acting contraceptive methods. The caption under this photo reads, "In Karachi, Pakistan, a doctor gives medicine and the equivalent of $1.59 to women who have been sterilized." These incentive programs, geared towards women in struggling families and often without access to adequate health care, created a coercive environment where people were forced to weigh reproductive health against other basic needs. And of course, there are other forms of incentives and disincentives, and we can talk about those if you're interested. If you want to learn more, check out Betsy Hartman's Reproductive Rights and Wrongs, and Desta will help you out with a link in the chat to that book. Excuse me. Population control in the US mirrored what was happening on the global scale. It too built on eugenics to target poor women of color and people with disabilities as unfit to reproduce and a burden on supposedly white taxpayers. Population control in the US included sterilization campaigns. Fears of the population bomb, spurred by various family planning programs paid for by the US government under the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964. This included forced sterilization of Native Americans and Mexican American women in the 1970s and 80s. Testing of long-acting reversible contraception. For instance, a Depo trial was conducted from 1972 to 1978 at the Grady Memorial Hospital in Atlanta, Georgia, in which which approximately 9,000 African American women participated. Many of the trial participants contend that they were not told of potential adverse effects, and some were coerced into taking part in the trial. Targeting of long-acting reversible contraceptives. In Killing the Black Body, Dorothy Roberts talks about Norplant distribution in the U.S. as population control and as closely related to international efforts to curtail Black and brown births. After all, Norplant was developed by the Population Council for population control purposes. U.S. policymakers embraced the potential of Norplant as a way to curtail poor Black women's fertility and reduce welfare costs in the U.S. There was a bill introduced that would have included money for Medicaid recipients to accept Norplant. It was promoted to young Black women as a quick fix for teen pregnancy. There were similar abuses with Norplant as within international campaigns. Doctors were not trained in the removal in the case of adverse effects, and Medicaid didn't cover the costs of removal. Population control abuses were powerfully and collectively challenged. Women's health advocates from around the world exposed abuses, protested, and formed strong coalitions for greater visibility and action. Feminist challenges helped to catalyze a major international policy shift away from population control. The shift manifested at the 1994 UN International Conference on Population and Development. Its program of action was endorsed by most of the world's governments and promotes a rights-based approach to sexual and reproductive health and emphasizes women's empowerment more generally. The program of action came out against targets, quotas, coercion, incentives, and disincentives in family planning. Population control became largely stigmatized as global policy. Now, Dustin, I'm going to ask if you would input the next poll, please. At this point, I hope I've shown that population control was just as damaging to reproductive autonomy as eugenics. But you may be thinking, yes, population control is wrong, but population is still an issue, right? So I want to hear from you and see where you're at with the idea of population and where you fall in your questions and your thinking about population as an issue. Give just a moment to input that poll and you a moment to rest your ears. You might also take this time to start writing questions in the Q&A. Oh, there's the poll. Forget I said that. So please choose one that makes the most sense to you. It doesn't need to be exact, just go with your gut. Population is a major challenge to planetary well-being. Population is a political scapegoat for global problems. Population is something I don't know much about. That seems to be badly edited by me. Okay. We'll give you a chance to answer. Population is a thing we have too much of. Population is a basic factor in policy making, public health, and etc. Please weigh in and let me know what you're thinking. All right, it looks like we are in different places and thinking about this in different ways, but it looks like many of you have a critical take on population, and I appreciate you answering this from your gut. All right, well, you can keep answering, but I am going to keep going. I thought we could continue this conversation by thinking through what population means today and by looking at today's numbers and projections. And again, feel free to put questions in the Q&A box as we go. The global growth is projected to peak at the end of this century, following by a leveling or slow decline. The total world population is increasing, but more and more slowly. These are the big lessons from this chart I have up here. The dark blue section shows population growth in size from 1760 to 2015, and we're at about 7.8 billion today. The light blue portion takes us forward with projected numbers to 2100, and the 2019 UN estimates predict we'll top out at about 10.9 billion by then. All these numbers are a little bit outdated. New ones will come out later this year. And of course, they don't account for the deaths from COVID or those otherwise related to the pandemic. Global growth comes primarily from countries with the youngest populations, many of which are in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is expected to contribute the majority of world population growth, followed by Central and South Asia. The large number of people of reproductive age means that growth is inevitable, even with the availability of contraception as part of comprehensive sexual and reproductive health services. And of course, COVID has interrupted these services in many parts of the world, which were already disrupted by the Trump-Pence Protecting Life in Global Health Assistance plan. That plan defunded essential HIV, malaria, and tuberculosis, contraception, and abortion services in different locations that rely on U.S. funding. So back to the chart. The red line shows the annual growth rate of the population, which peaked into the 1960s and has steadily gone down since that time. Ironically, it started to go down before population control was enforced. People started having fewer babies for all kinds of reasons, but a really big one was higher child survival rates. Now, smaller families are the new norm. The average family size is 2.5 children per pregnant person, close to half the 1960s standard. Almost half the people in the world today live in countries where the average number of children is below 2.1. In the US, the so-called COVID baby bust is thought to speed existing downward trends. US birth rates have declined since the 1960s and have hovered around replacement level, which is defined as 2 children per pregnant person, since the 1970s. It fell to 1.73 per pregnant person, the lowest in since the 1970s in 2018. In the US, population growth comes from immigration. Recent draconian immigration restrictions and abuses have meant that the US population growth rate in 2019-20 was the smallest in 120 years. The US is an aging country among many. Globally, the number of people 65 years and over is expected to double by 2050. 55 countries are expected to undergo a population decrease because there are more deaths than births, and all countries are expected to follow this trajectory at different paces. So the numbers and population dynamics are rapidly changing, and many people say that the so-called population bomb was a dud and never exploded. Why? Partly because alarm about population wrongly blamed growth and size for problems that have much more complex origins. Consider this. As scholar Jade Sasser describes in her book On Infertile Ground, several studies have shown that countries with fewer babies have higher rates of greenhouse gas emissions and historical carbon legacies. The US is one of these countries. But the higher rates of emissions here can't be simply attributed to per capita consumption. That shifts responsibility from the worst institutional emitters and practices who drive extraction, production, and consumption. It shifts it to individuals' lifestyle choices. The US military is the largest institutional consumer of petroleum in the world. Given its extensive infrastructure and operations, both domestically and overseas, the US military consumes more liquid fuels and emits more CO2 than many medium-sized countries. 20 fossil fuel companies have contributed to more than a third of all energy-related carbon dioxide and methane emissions worldwide since 1965. Chevron topped the list of investor-owned corporations, followed closely by Exxon, BP, and Shell. Together, these four global businesses have been behind more than 10% of the world's carbon emissions since 1965. In other words, capitalist markets, lack of energy industry regulations and standards, and militarization are important reasons for historical and current greenhouse gas emissions. These aren't natural processes that increase with each person. They are driven by power and politics, not by population growth or societal need. And this is a really quick example of what could be an entire talk, and I hope it sparks conversation between us. But what I'm trying to do is interrupt the idea that population size and growth are the primary reasons for things like climate change. Uprooting population alarmism from our thinking is key to better understanding the real contributors of problems and taking more meaningful action. It is fundamental to upholding reproductive justice and challenging population control in the here and now. I really urge you to read Jade Sasser's fantastic book, On Infertile Ground. And Desta, if you could pop that into the chat as a resource for people to have a continued conversation. Thanks. So I want to move on to what eugenics and population control look like now. Both were discredited and destigmatized, but never uprooted. They have powerful legacies today. And I'm going to mention a few of these for eugenics and a few for population control, with the understanding that there's immense overlap. And of course, this is a partial list, which can and should be expanded. Let's start with eugenics in the US. Restrictive immigration laws. The Trump administration's zero-tolerance immigration policy was based on eugenics and white supremacist state law that criminalized migration and migrants. This is a direct enforcement of eugenics-era law in the context of restrictive, criminalizing, xenophobic US immigration policies that seem to transcend political administrations. The forced sterilization of incarcerated people. Forced sterilization continues in the US. Between 1997 and 2014, over 1,000 women were forcibly sterilized in California prisons, most of them Black. You can learn more about the sterilizations and the courageous activists who stopped them in the 2020 documentary Belly of the Beast. And Desta, could you please put the reference for Belly of the Beast? Thank you. As nurse Dawn Wooten bravely exposed in 2020, ICE detainees held in the Irwin County Detention Center, the corporate-run ICE prison in Georgia, were subjected to medical abuses, including forced sterilization and unwanted Depo injections. And as of April 29, there were no more women are no longer detained in the detention center, and that's in large part because of the activism to shut down Irwin surrounding Dawn's whistleblowing. You can learn more from the incredible health, healing, justice, and liberation statement that Project South and co-authors wrote. Thank you, Jessica. That exposes the eugenic roots of these abuses in the context of other racist, ableist structures and systems. Designer babies. Eugenics ideals are threaded throughout the production of so-called valued life, when assisted reproductive technologies meet with genetic selection. For instance, what Rajani Bhatia calls lifestyle sex selection, the industry invites you to complete your family by selecting the gender of your fetus through biomedical markers. Genetic editing offers the potential to correct mutations in human germline tissue. The fertility industry actively recruits egg donors at top-tier U.S. colleges and universities. These cellular-level efforts to create better humans raise troubling questions about the race-gendered ableist class values of what is considered to be better. LARC to reduce poverty. While privatized biomedicine assists in elite reproduction, contraception, particularly long-acting reversible contraception, is still promoted as a way to reduce poverty. This claim has been popularized in recent op-eds, promoted in philanthropy, and embraced by some in public health. For instance, Blue Meridian Partners, a 501c3 philanthropy that funds groups like the Contraceptive Promoters Upstream, states on their website, and I quote, "Expanding contraceptive access can help break the cycle of multi-generational poverty for the millions of women who have unplanned pregnancies annually and save taxpayers billions of dollars." You could throw that flashbulb on that and send it back 100 years to the Fitter Families contest in Topeka, Kansas, right? Rising fascism, eco-fascism. And finally, back to the connection of eugenics and so-called pure wilderness. Today, eco-fascists seek to protect the wilderness from Black and brown immigrants. The shooter who murdered 22 people in El Paso, Texas in August 2019 was an eco-fascist who claimed to be protecting the environment from invaders. White supremacist Richard Spencer, in his statement that incited the 2017 Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, cited protection of nature as one of the reasons white supremacists need to grab power. There's this sort of renaissance of patriots reclaiming the wilderness for white masculinity. These ideas are openly expressed and increasingly part of the US right-wing mainstream. Take Arizona Attorney General Mark Baronovich's claims that in his recent federal lawsuit. He is suing the Biden administration for failing to uphold Trump-era immigration restrictions, including the construction of the border wall, on the grounds that this will encourage migrants to the US who will degrade the environment. Baronovich asserts that this violates the US National Environmental Protection Act, as, and I quote, "As more and more people come into the country, it has more and more devastating impact on our environment," Baronovich said. Moving on to population control, and again, there's immense overlap between these categories. Family caps. Today, there are two-child policies in China and in some states in India. These policies explicitly restrict people's reproduction by withholding social benefits, the right to vote, or the right to hold office for those who exceed family limits. And while last year India rejected a proposed law to mandate a national two-child policy, Prime Minister Narendra Modi told the nation that population control was a form of patriotism. Forced sterilization. As recently as 2014, coercive sterilization programs targeted Indian women from tribal and lower castes, women living with HIV from countries in Africa and Latin America, and Roma women in Europe. Currently, the Chinese government is enforcing population control of Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims in what some are calling a genocide. The government is conducting forced sterilizations and abortions and forcibly implanting IUDs in detainees at over 200 detention camps. These abuses are part of the Chinese government's strike hard against violent terrorism that has been taking place since 2014. You can learn more in a recently released report by Human Rights Watch. And Jessica, that is available to put in the chat, please. Thank you. Targets in family planning. On a larger scale, there are powerful international family planning efforts to reduce population growth rates with the use of targets. And if you recall, targets were discredited in 1994 at the International Conference on Population Development. The FP 2020 network, which includes governments, nonprofits, donors, multilaterals, and others, aim to get 120 million new users on modern contraception by the year 2020 and set a 120 by 20 target. Now FP 2020 has become FP 2030 to align with the Sustainable Development Goals end date of 2030. And while the organization seems to be dropping its focus on the target, the target has already had a ripple effect in policy and planning. For instance, the Ouagadougou Partnership is a regional family planning initiative with the goal of 2.2 million new users of contraceptives by last year in 9 Western African countries. The partnership upped its target numbers following the first FP 2020 summit under urging from international partners. Coercion and LARC. The international drive to get LARC into bodies has had impact. The Implant Access Program is a public-private initiative in which powerful donors, including the Gates and Clinton Foundations, buy hormonal implants from Big Pharma and make them available to governments and nonprofits. This has had the effect of both building and skewing global markets in favor of implants. These include JDEL or Norplant 2. As with Norplant 1 in Indonesia and the US in the 1990s, providers have been trained in JDEL insertion, but fewer in removal. This means, again, that those who experience adverse effects have no recourse. If you want to learn more about this, you could check out a paper I wrote called Population in the Troubled Present, and Desta can put that, thank you, Desta, in the chat for you. Promotion of Depo. At the same time, there is mass dissemination of this Press, which is the brand name for a lower dosage formulation of Depo-Provera, which is administered just under the skin. The Depo shot was an intramuscular shot, and so this is a different application. This is significant for several reasons. First, in summer 2019, the results of a controversial human trial showed a 23 to 29% increased biological risk of getting HIV when using Depo. If you want to learn more about this important issue, you can check out Who to Trust, a PopDev Different Takes by public health physician, epidemiologist, and scholar C. Satyamala. And Desta, you have that. Thank you. Despite the potential for what could be an almost 30% risk of increased risk of HIV acquisition, the World Health Organization announced there was no link between Depo and HIV. Many researchers and advocates warn that this announcement is misleading and dangerous. As the authors of an open letter to World Health Organization from Africa write, quote, "It seems clear to us that for African women and girls, it has been decided that a pregnancy is worse than an HIV infection," end quote. The potential for HIV seems to be the same with the Press as with the Depo-Provera shot. Nonetheless, a collaborative including US nonprofits, PATH, and John Snow are disseminating the Press in 12 African countries. Nearly 500,000 doses were administered in the first 2 years alone. Sudanese refugees in camps in Uganda report being unable to access sexual and reproductive health care services or get contraception, except if they enroll and pass Uganda's Sayana Press pilot study. This is coercion. Finally, population control is being revived as the best way to mitigate climate change and pursue environmental sustainability. For instance, the Thriving Together campaign is sponsored by the UK-based Margaret Pike Trust's Population and Sustainability Network. It seeks to align family planning and environmental organizations, conservation organizations behind family planning for the planet. Of course, the family planning is intended for cis women, not for the earth. While voluntary, it is aimed at reducing population numbers rather than enabling people to access a full range of reproductive services. It's certainly not a reproductive justice approach. Supporters include influential multilateral agencies like the United Nations Population Fund, family planning organizations like FB 2030, and the environmental groups like the Center for Biological Diversity and the Nature Conservancy. The Thriving Together statement, signed by 150 human and environmental health NGOs, says, quote, "Increasing human pressures are among the many challenges facing planetary health. Ensuring family planning is available to all those who seek it is among the positive actions we must take to lessen these pressures." Unfortunately, this focus on fertility reduction undermines reproductive justice and could undermine volunteerism, and it certainly blames human fertility for environmental problems rather than looking at their core causes. If you want to take a more critical, if you want more critical takes on this population environment approach, check out a renewed call for feminist resistance to population control, and Desta has a reference to that in the chat. And now I want to turn it over to you. Thank you for listening to my long comments. Typically, I really love to have a back and forth, and this is a little bit of a challenge with a platform like this, but I'm glad to see some questions in the chat, and I invite you to go in, write more questions, but you can also click on the little thumb at the side and ask the question, to show which question that you would like to see answered. All right. Give you a moment to orient yourselves. So the first question I see is from Emily. Hi, Emily. And Emily asked, can you talk about how population control is often, just one moment, I'm going to stop my share so you can see us talking. Okay, can you talk about how population control is often labeled as a feminist stance today, and even endorsed by some feminists, since on the surface, increasing access to birth control is seen as positive? That is an excellent point and question. So it's happening on many planes. So in one respect, organizations that have typically been populationist or come out against population growth have embraced a different message. In fact, some are embracing a reproductive justice message. So a good example of this is the organization that was founded by Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb. He founded Zero Population Growth, and that organization is better known today as Population Connection. And Population Connection has been endorsing a reproductive justice standpoint, but with still the main goal of addressing what they call overpopulation, and the main goal of bringing down fertility rates as the key to helping us achieve population stabilization and environmental sustainability. So, and Jade Sasser has written really compellingly about this, and you can find her work in her book on Infertile Ground. But the embrace of reproductive justice is really partial, and it is complicated because when these groups are adopting the idea that reproductive justice is climate justice, it really muddies what their actual key values are and what they're trying to do. So that's happening on one level, this real appropriation of reproductive justice language that doesn't, in fact, uphold all of the tenets of reproductive justice. At the same time, the idea that, let me go back to Emily's question because I want to reorient myself. Yes, access to contraception can be incredibly positive and life-changing, and supporting contraceptive access is important, particularly with the conservative backlash against services that came with the Trump administration and with the interruption of services that we've seen with COVID. At the same time, the linking of birth control or contraception with a whole set of other agendas, whether they're economic or environmental, really can undermine the volunteerism and undermine the quality of services, the point of sexual and reproductive health, right? So when the agenda is a win-win, as it's often put, for women, for the environment, and for economies to bring down birth rates, it really sets the value that contraceptive use is important and it should be used to regulate your own fertility. I think I have covered some of the bases. I think Emily could answer it as well. Emily did a wonderful senior thesis about population control and economies. So, thanks, Emily. All right, I'm going to go to Lucy's question. What impact do you think the anticipated downward trend in global population will have on population control policies? Are we seeing any of these impacts already? I think that population control is being used very selectively in many ways to control minority ethnic religious groups, right? There's what we're seeing in China right now, the targeting of Muslim groups, and it's also playing out in India with the regulation of Muslim fertility and the idea that Muslims are going to outnumber us through pro-natalist, through having too many babies, right? So there's this really ugly and damaging targeting that is happening toward particular peoples that is part of population control and seems to be alive and well even as population has gone down. We're also seeing this, the sort of, in eugenics, the idea of the positive, the desirable, and the negative, the tainted or undesirable bodies. So the greater segregation of these two categories. So population control is very much about who is encouraged to have children. So there's these pro-natalist programs in some countries, like for instance, Germany had a population policy that was the government that aimed to increase the number of births of a certain segment of the population, so educated white Germans. And at the same time, it was had very restrictive immigration policies, and was through their international development program was actively discouraging births through the promotion of long-acting reversible contraception, some of which the methods weren't available in Germany. So right, there's the continuum of population control as pronatal and antenatal, and who it targets for control and who it targets for having children. But I think that the population alarmism and the advocacy for population control will continue because these ideas have stayed alive throughout the changing population size. Really, no matter how many we are, it seems to be too many. And so really uprooting these ideas is not going to come as a byproduct of the population size changing, the world population changing. And in this particular moment, since the majority of births are happening in sub-Saharan Africa, international family planning is very much concentrated on lowering births in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think we're going to see a concerted effort towards population reduction there for years to come. What do you think is the main contributor to projected population, the smaller population growth rate in the U.S.? There's a number of different things that are being tossed around, including economics is usually pointed to as a big factor in terms of people feeling like they can afford children, that they want to have multiple children. You know, right now with COVID, there's been some speculation that people have just stopped having sex because obviously all sex is procreative. But I don't really have a very good answer to that. And perhaps if someone has a very good answer to that, they could pop it in the chat. But I think that they're giving a lot of reasons that are about economics, about how hard it is to raise children in the society, but also that these are the demographic trends that are happening around the world. In partial and inadequate answer to a good question. I did not mention China's one-child policy. The person is asking, did you mention China's approach to population control? I did not talk about China's one-child policy, which is one of the biggest and sustained population control efforts that really led to dramatic abuses and was a real tragedy. It lasted for over 30 years, and now China has shifted to a two-child policy, which has in the effort to increase population growth rates, which has really seemed to have very little impact on the number of children that people are having. Yeah. So I've hit all the questions. I invite you to look me up. I invite you to write more now, as I'm open to any questions. I didn't really adequately address, the sort of questions that people typically have when you're very concerned about environmental degradation and climate change, and how to reconcile concerns that you have about population with what's going on, these major crises. And it's a lot easier to do that if we're face to face, but I invite your ongoing questions, and I invite your ongoing questioning, and encourage you to check out some of the resources if this is going to fit with what you are questioning about. Let me see. Oh, there's a lot more questions, excuse me. Apparently I can't use my cursor. All right, sorry about that. Okay. Jennifer Hamilton, hello Jennifer, asked the question, have you seen people involved in population control talking about the benefits of COVID? I have, and I have tried to, it's a whole sort of very ugly research hole to go into to find out about how people are talking about the benefits of COVID, not just on the environment, but on the sort of potential for death rates to positively impact population size and therefore the environment. So not just the shutdown having positive environmental effects, but COVID death, which is a really ugly thought. One of the things that consistently breaks my heart is going to talks and to protests about climate change and seeing the sign up that says, save the planet, kill yourself, right? So this sort of idea that somehow that it's not just birth rates we should be concerned about, but this sort of ugly corollary that death rates and knocking yourself off will somehow benefit the environment. But it's out there, and it's something that I think more and more with COVID, I've been thinking about how population is not just impacted by birth rates, it's impacted by death rates. And so this is the conversation that's going to be happening more and more, not just with COVID, but as the planet ages, or as we age and the planet does its thing. Thanks for that question. Let's see. I'm curious about the rhetoric we're hearing about the U.S. competing with China in terms of birth rates. That is new to me. I'm not sure what that is, and I'd be curious to hear if you want to pop something in the chat. Neither China nor the U.S. is particularly robust with birth rates right now, so I don't know how we would be in competition. I'm going to switch but thank you for the question and alert me to what I'm missing, please. Let's see, someone is asking, what do you think it would look like for us to address environmental issues, sustainability of the planet without a eugenic framework? Well, environmental justice, climate justice groups are doing a fantastic job of centering not only the important issues of environmental degradation and toxicities, but also looking at the racist injustices that are happening that need to be addressed within environmental action. So I think there's a lot of beautiful examples. You could check out the NAACP's Environmental Justice Project, or I'm not sure of the formal name, that with Jackie Patterson does beautiful work. I think of We Act East Harlem, like any sort of environmental justice group that really centers community action and the priorities of those most affected by environmental change and catastrophe. So every time the social justice approach I would take definitely before thinking about it outside of a eugenic framework. And right now, one of the interesting things that is happening that I didn't put in the talk because it was so long was that environmental groups in the US are really reckoning with their past, this eugenic past, and shifting. The Sierra Club, not too long ago, had an ad campaign that said the fate of the world is in your hands and in your pants. And I love to use this as a slide to talk about the ways in which environmental groups were equating population growth with environmental harm. In 2019, the Sierra Club came out with a sort of reckoning of their past thought and a shift on what population control means, and a real move away from population alarmism. And this part of this reckoning came with in conversation about what this rising eco-fascism means, and also with thinking about how they deal with their founder, one of their founders, John Muir, and his involvement with eugenics. So that's a little bit of a side comment, but at the same time, mainstream, check out what the Sierra Club has to say these days. So I think that there's a lot of ways to reckon with, join in coalition with others who are concerned about environmental issues, both from a social justice perspective and from other perspectives, that really get at the core of some of these deep-seated environmental problems, which I am in full agreement are very worrying. Let me see. I think just as U.S. birth rates go down, will China be trying to increase their birth rates? Oh, I see. China is very much trying to increase the birth rates among certain, the majority, but it's not working. And on the whole, pro-natalist programs don't seem to catch on. They're not very sexy, even when they're attached to economic incentives and to structures that are meant to support families and parents. So yes, China is trying to increase their birth rates. Perhaps the U.S. will do the same. I mean, certainly there is a variable birth rate between different demographic groups in the U.S. So this would be a much better conversation than it is typed and my response, but I appreciate you raising it. Is that everybody? I'm glad I learned to use the cursor. That was helpful. Oh, okay. Well, before Lucy, I hand the mic to Lucy, I just want to thank you for being here and invite you to, I'm going to pop my email in the chat, and you are welcome to write to me, ask questions, tell me what you're doing, what you're concerned about. But I appreciate you being here, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne. That was great. I always learn so much from you, even though we talk about this stuff all the time. I continue to learn, which is great. Desta is going to put in the chat an evaluation form. If you could take a moment to fill that out, we'd appreciate it. Your feedback is really helpful to us. So this event is open until 3 for networking and visiting our sponsors in the expo area. You can click on the links to the left of your screen to visit either area. And I want to invite everyone to our next event in the series, which will be a screening of the short film Abortion Helpline, This is Lisa, followed by a panel discussion. And that's happening just a day after tomorrow on Thursday, May 6th at 7 p.m. Eastern. So I hope you will join us for that, and you'll receive a link to that event tomorrow. So thank you again, Anne. Thank you to our interpreters and to the CLIP staff for making this happen. And we'll see you next time.